In this video I'll show you how to send out emails from Interform400 while getting the email addresses from the spool file contents. First, I'll introduce you to the email finishing definition, which is widely used, and in this finishing definition we can define some variables to pick from the spool file and include in the attachment name as part of the attachment name or in the contents of the email. We are able to break up a spool file into parts and email the individual parts while merging them into a attached PDF file. And for breaking up the spool file, we would need some way of identifying when are we going to create a new email. Next question, of course, is how are we going to select the email address from the spool file, and we will also cover the possibility to address the customer in their own language, so it can be flexible which language you are writing in your email, and also the attachment name can be dependent on the preferred customer language. For handling the email addresses, then perhaps for some of the customers the email address is blank, indicating that you don't have an email address registered for this customer, or it could be that someone by mistake inserted a wrong email address, meaning that the email address isn't actually a valid email address, for instance without the @ sign. So I'll show you how to handle that situation here in Interform as well. And finally I'll take you through the automation process, so you can automatically send out the emails when the spool file is created or arriving on a monitored output queue. So let's go into Interform. And before I start, I'll just show you the contents of the spool file that I would like to use for this demonstration. So the spool file looks like this. In line 1, position 1, we have the email address, and line 2, we have 2 characters identifying the preferred language of this receiver. Now if we go into Autoforms control, option 5, and look into the finishing definitions with option 4, now let's take a look at this prepared email finishing definition. So the email finishing definition is functionality that we're using for preparing the email process. So it's able to identify the various emails that we're going to send out, and any pages where we don't have an email address, well, we can choose to take those pages and merge them and put the merged result, for instance, into envelopes and send them out as normal letters. For this, I'm creating an email finishing definition, which is a type 5, and then we'll more or less go from top down. So the first question will be how to find the email address. So we can find the email address by key, but that means that we need to create a table here in this definition. So this is seldomly used as a customer would normally have your own database, or you're able to actually write the email address directly into the spool file. So normally you would go with either option 2 or 3. Option 2 here is covered in another video. Here we'll cover option 3, how to find it in the spool file. Depending on the selection in option 1, the other options here will close or open depending on their choice. So for instance, option 2 is now closed. So you can see it's suspended because of selection option 1. We don't need to define a key, and we can't actually create any key here. So in the next option 3, we can define some variables that we're going to select from the spool file and include in the PDF file name that we are attaching to the outgoing email, or as a contents addressing the person who is going to receive the email. So first we just define some variables and how long these variables are going to be. Secondly, we define a PDF file name. We can here define the default name and later override that per language if we want to name it something else for different countries. Next thing is the email text. We're going to send out an email, and we're going to address the customer, and here we can actually write the customers in various languages. Normally, I would say it's my impression that customers are only using one, for instance, an English text. So you have a text version here for internal reference, an internal description, the subject, which is the subject of the outgoing email, and here we can include the variables as a part of that. So it's asterisk with a capital V and a number at the end. For the actual email, you can choose either to send it out as a simple text, fixed font. You can go with HTML with H to make Interform encapsulate this in some HTML commands to make it a more nicer proportional font. You can write your own HTML, or you can go with X to refer to an external HTML file in the IFS, and where you can include images and so on in that, and even variables as well in that external HTML file. Here I'm also using variables as a part of the text. So we are addressing the customer by the customer contact person and the company, and we have the invoice number here. And currently here we are referring to the default PDF file name for the English version. In this case, we want to address some of our customers in German, so we have the equivalent text for the email in German, and we can here override the default PDF file name to have the invoice in German, Rechnung, and the invoice number as a part of the attached file name. Good. Next question in option 6 is how we're going to divide the spool file into individual emails. It is possible to have a page selection criteria here if the email address and the contents of the variables are not found on all the pages, then you need to specify here which pages that actually include that. If they are included on all the pages, you can just leave this blank. And for that page selection criteria, you can here tell Interform when do we have a level break. So it means that if this information changes, then you will get a new email. And for this situation here, I've chosen to select the position of the email address, the receiving email address. So if we have a new receiver, then of course we want a new email. Hitting enter, and now we are asked about the email address that we're going to send to, the position in the spool file. That was line 1, position 1. If we had the name of the receiver, we could have set where to pick that out in the spool file. Or it will be the start position, and then we'll grab the 50 position from that position on. Have a carbon copy receiver. If you have interfax as well, you could also have combined this with faxing in a different position than the email address. Here for the text version, we want to select the text version that we're going to use for the email. So here we had the two text versions, GB for the English version and DE for the German version. So here we are selecting 2 characters in that position from the spool file. So this is like a dynamically selecting the text version file depending on the data found in the spool file. If you only have one text version, you could just select nothing here from the spoof file, claim this, and then for instance go with GB or whatever, a fixed name. So you type in the fixed name here, or you can even combine this prefix with whatever you find in the spoof file. So for this you would perhaps have a txt underscore, and then you would have the 2 characters found in spoof file added at the end of this. So it could be, for instance, DE or GB, depending on what we find here. In this case, we'll select it dynamically from spool. We have here a invoice number, selecting that from spoof file, contact person, and company. So we just specify the lines and positions. I mentioned earlier on that it could be that the email address here that we're selecting from the spoof file for some customers is blank. And that won't be an issue for Interform, because if it's blank, Interform will know, well, you don't have an email address, and then it will come out as a separate, in a separate spoof file, which we can handle in Autoform's control. You might also find some invalid email addresses in the spoof file. If, of course, we expect to find a valid email address with the user in front of the @ the domain, and after the @ and that they both contain only valid characters, and you have that @. So if we find that the email address is invalid, then you will actually get an error message later on, unless you register here an email address syntax error handler in option 14. So you type in the email address of this internal handler in your company, and this specific person will then receive any emails that contain an invalid email address. Now we'll go into the Autoform's control and make the automation of this process. So for this demonstration, I'm using the output queue AFC input 1, which is only for demo purposes. You shouldn't use that for production unless you're running an Interform Lite version. First, there are some general questions about the setup, and here we have the process. So what happens is that a spoof file, when it arrives, we can now through function 1 here call the finishing definition that we have just made, and first we set up a condition here to select that spoof file that we want to email. But now we need to uniquely select that spoof file and make sure that the result of the finishing definition for here, for instance, is not triggering the finishing definition once again. So one way could be to have a unique form type. You can also combine that with the spoof file name and so on. I'm hitting enter. Now we select the finishing definition, which you can select with F4, and we specify where are the temporary spoof files placed, because we are actually emailing here in 2 steps. First of all, we are preparing to do the email, so any pages that we're going to email are now put into separate spoof files, 1 spoof file per email, and we're putting that back to the same output queue with a specific form type here called email. So it's important that this form type fits with the condition for the P function that you see down here. Hitting enter, and now there might be some other pages where the email address is blank, and for those pages we will put them into a non-mail spoof file, and that spoof file will in this case get the form type of print, and we could use this form type as a condition for function 1 merge with spoof file, so it actually prints out, merge those pages and prints them out as a normal PCL spoof file. So the second part of this process would be the P function, and I can show you here with F23. function here, send PDF, email or fax, so you can actually fax with Interfax with this very same procedure that you have here. Yeah, so we're going to email, we set up the condition for that, hit enter. We're going to merge with an overlay on overlay selector and create a PDF file which will be attached to the outgoing email. And I just hit enter. Yeah, some details about the actual email, if we're going to use a specific user profile when we place it in the IFS, and if we want to compress the text inside of the PDF file to decrease the size. So that's it. So we are actually done preparing for the process. And let me just go into the output queue, option 12. And I've chosen here to hold the spool file as soon as it has been handled by Interform, so that's why we have the spool files based down here in the bottom. And this is my input spool file, so if I now release it once again, you want to see that we have additional spool files. And if I go into my mail log, which I can access through the menu or through the command work mail log, then we can actually see these outgoing emails. So you see here, some of them, the emails are in English and some in German. Here we can open the English one with option 11, and now you can see that the attachment is in English, invoice with the number we grabbed from the spool file, and we are also addressing the receiver in the manner that we expected. And for the German one, we have of course the equivalent. Just to explain the process in details, we can actually look a bit behind the scenes. Before we call the P function to actually send out those emails, we are generating these temporary spool files, the PIS print, which you could delete in the autoforms control setup. But here we can just look into the background and see how you can actually verify what you're going to send out without actually sending it out. So if you want to do a bit of preparing and testing, you can just leave out the call of the P function and then verify here how the actual output would be, the contents of the email and what the attachment will be called and so on. Yeah. So with this, I hope I have given you an idea of how to send out emails while using the email address from the spool file contents. For further information, you can refer to the Interform400 manual or check out some of the other videos on YouTube. Bye.